James had always enjoyed the rhythm of routine. The hum of the city, the familiar shuffle of commuters, and the dull murmur of the subway tracks brought him a strange comfort. But one day, while sitting on the crowded train, something unusual caught his eye, a figure across the car, indistinct, with no features on their face. He blinked. Surely, it was a trick of the light. His mind brushed it off, convincing him that fatigue was playing games with his vision. But the figure remained. The more he stared, the more real it became, a person among the crowd with smooth, blank skin where their features should have been. Heart racing, James looked away. Ignore it, he thought. But that wasn't the end. The next day, a new figure appeared, faceless, sitting closer this time, staring in his direction without eyes. Things were getting worse. On his daily commute, more of them appeared. They were never the same, their bodies shifted, their blank faces eerily still. James could feel them watching, though they had no eyes. His throat tightened each time one of them came into view. But this day was different, it was as if they knew. As he boarded the subway, a figure sat right next to him. Close. Too close. Its skin was smooth, its head tilted in his direction, though it had no eyes, no mouth, no expression at all. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow. Sweat dripped down his back, and he could barely swallow the lump forming in his throat. He tried to shift away, but the subway was packed. His hand brushed against its shoulder, and a jolt of cold shot through his entire body. The figure didn't move. It was solid, as real as any other person, yet it felt wrong, like touching the void. His skin crawled. Suddenly, the lights in the subway flickered. For a brief second, everything went black, and when the lights came back, the faceless figure had turned its head completely toward him. He felt his blood turn to ice. Though it had no eyes, it was looking directly into him. James bolted off the train at the next stop, his legs shaky, his hands trembling. But as he walked away, he sensed it, the figure had followed him. He glanced over his shoulder, and there it was, standing under the streetlight, motionless, watching him with its non-existent eyes. The distance between them was shrinking, inch by inch. From that night, nothing felt real anymore. The faceless figures began to appear everywhere. It wasn't just the subway. James would see them standing outside his apartment window, motionless. One stood at the corner of his street, watching him as he left for work, and when he returned home, there it was, standing even closer. He couldn't escape them. His mind was unraveling. His friends noticed the change, his boss had even pulled him aside to ask if he was okay. But how could he explain this without sounding insane? Who would believe him? James tried to rationalize it, tried to convince himself that it was some kind of psychotic break or a stress-induced hallucination. But it didn't feel like that. The fear was too real. The figures were too solid. Soon, his apartment no longer felt safe. At night, he would hear whispers, even though the walls were thin, and the building was noisy. The whispers were different, not like his neighbors talking through the walls. They were inside his mind. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder. James, the voices called his name over and over, though no one was there. In his bathroom mirror, he started seeing their reflection, just behind him, standing in the doorway. He'd spin around, but the hallway would be empty. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his toothbrush. His pulse never slowed, his nerves frayed, his sanity crumbled. He avoided the subway at all costs, opting for taxis or walking, but no matter what he did, they were there, silent, faceless, following him, creeping closer. James jerked awake in the dead of night, heart racing and drenched in cold sweat. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Then, he heard it, soft footsteps, creeping just outside his bedroom door. His pulse skyrocketed. The faceless ones had always stayed distant, haunting him from the edges of his life. But now, they were in his apartment. He could feel them, waiting. James, a soft voice, like a breath, drifted through the cracks of the door. His body froze. The sound was barely audible, but unmistakable. They were calling him. His name, carried on the air like a warning. Desperately, he scrambled out of bed, his limbs trembling as he moved toward the door. His hand hovered over the handle, heart pounding in his ears. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead. When he finally mustered the courage to pull the door open, what he saw nearly stopped his heart. They were there. The faceless ones stood in the hallway, completely still, yet somehow they felt more alive than ever. Their heads, devoid of features, turned slowly toward him as though sensing his presence. There were so many of them now. His breath hitched as he stepped back. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in on him. How had they gotten so close? They had always been at a distance, just far enough to ignore, but now they filled the hallway, watching him without eyes. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, echoing in his skull, bouncing off the walls in a maddening rhythm. James. James, his mind was unraveling, terror clawing at the edges of his sanity. He slammed the door shut, his body trembling violently. They were inside his home. His last safe space was gone. Nowhere was safe. He rushed to the bathroom, the one place that still felt somewhat secure, locking the door behind him and pressing his back against it. His eyes darted to the mirror, seeking some sort of solace. But when he looked up, he wasn't alone. In the reflection stood one of the faceless figures, looming just behind him, motionless, with that awful, empty face. James recoiled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. He blinked, but the figure didn't disappear. Slowly, it reached out, its hand grazing his shoulder, though he could feel nothing but the cold emptiness it brought with it. As the room seemed to spin, the whispers became unbearable, and his vision blurred. There was no escape, they had come for him. Ames ran. His breath was ragged as he dashed into the bathroom, slamming the door behind him, his back pressed hard against it. His chest heaved with each panicked breath, his eyes darting around the small room. The whispers surrounded him now, bouncing off the tiles, echoing inside his head. The mirror stood before him, cracked from the countless times he had slammed his fist against it in frustration. But tonight, something else caught his eye. A figure in the reflection, standing behind him. He spun around, nothing. But when he looked back into the mirror, it was still there, standing closer than before. His body trembled as he leaned forward, staring at the reflection. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but behind him, the faceless figure was reaching out, its featureless head tilting in curiosity. James screamed, grabbing the edge of the sink, his knuckles white from the grip. But the figure kept getting closer. Then, in a single heartbeat, the figure's face transformed. It wasn't blank anymore. It had his face, his own eyes, staring back at him. His scream died in his throat as his reflection smirked, twisting into a distorted version of him. Slowly, the faceless figure, now with James' face, leaned forward and whispered, "We've always been here." The lights flickered once more. When they came back, the reflection was gone.